Basically, I said I'm Haleh Esfandiari, the director of the Middle East program, and welcomed you to today's meeting, which is co-sponsored with MIT. I would like to thank Sanam Anderlini for suggesting the meeting to us and helping us getting our speakers. Welcome, Sanam, to here. There is, I think, number of copies of the joint statement by the experts on Iran outside, so I would urge you to pick it up on your way out. Officials and diplomats may disagree on whether it is wise for the U.S. to engage directly with Iran and on how to do so and when. But everyone agrees, I think, that Iran is a difficult issue to address. But there is a history, America's and that of other countries, of dealing with Iran since the establishment of the Islamic Republic. Perhaps there are lessons, some useful to be learned from the past. Today we have with us 4 people eminently qualified to draw lessons from the past for the present and also talk about the futures. Our speakers are Gian Domenico Pico, Robin Wright, Robert Litvak, and John Tierman. Mr. Pico founded GDP Associate in 1994 to provide risk solution to companies mainly operating in the Middle East region. He was an Undersecretary General of the United Nations and served as the personal representative of the Secretary General for the United Nations Year of Dialogue Among Civilizations. Among his notable achievements during this time included the United Nations efforts leading to the release of the Western hostages in Lebanon and the negotiations which led to the ceasefire between Iran and Iraq. Mr. Pico was a household name in Iran. Everybody knew of him because he was so active in that. He represented the Secretary General in the negotiations of the Geneva Accord in 1998 on Afghanistan and in the Rainbow Warrior arbitration. Robin Wright, who is currently a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center, is a diplomatic correspondent for was a diplomatic correspondent for the Washington Post. She has reported from over 140 countries for the Post, the Los Angeles Times, CBS News, the New Yorker, the Sunday Times, and her articles have appeared in the New York Times Magazine. She is the author of The Last Great Revolution, Turmoil and Transformation in Iran, Sacred Rage, The Wrath of Militant Islam, Flashpoints, Promise and Peril in a New World, and In the Name of God, The Khomeini Decade, and her last book was Dreams and Shadows, The Future of the Middle East. Robert Litvak is the Director of International Security Studies at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and Adjunct Professor at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service and a consultant to the Los Alamos National Laboratory. Dr. Litvak served on the National Security Council staff as Director for Non-Proliferation in the first Clinton administration. His most recent books are Rogue States and U.S. Foreign Policy, Containment After the Cold War, and Regime Change, U.S. Strategy Through the Prism of 9/11. John Tierman, welcome back to the center, is the Executive Director of MIT's Center for International Studies, where he is also Principal Research Scientist. Previously, he was Program Director at the Social Science Research Council from 2000 to 2004, a Fulbright Senior Scholar in Cyprus, 1999 to 2000, Executive Director of the Winston Foundation for World Peace, and senior editor at the Union of Concerned Scientists. His books include 100 Ways America is Screwing Up the World in 2006, Spoils of War, The Human Cost of America's Arms Trade, and Making the Money Sink, Private Wealth and Public Power in the Search for Peace. We will start with Mr. Pico, move on to Robert Litvak, Robin Wright, and John Tierman. Before I give the floor to Mr. Pico, I would like to ask you to close your cell phones, your Blackberries. I mean, really close them. Don't put it even on mute because it interferes with our live webcast. I would also like to welcome Ambassador Joseph Gildenhorn, the chairman of the board of the Wilson Center, who is a faithful supporter of the Middle East program. Thank you and welcome, Joe, for coming.
Thank you.
You can speak from here.
Thank you. I will speak from here.
Okay.
Good morning. Thank you for your kind introduction. Since you asked to switch off the cell phones and similar gadgets, I'm tempted to suggest to switch off your ears for what I'm going to say. I don't think it is of any novelty to you, so you may as well take a nap and then wait for the next speaker. I spent 20 years in the UN. I left in 92, and I thought that I'd achieved what I wanted to do, which was to be a manual worker of diplomacy. And I will therefore give you the comments of a manual worker, not of a professor, not of an analyst. I've learned what I've learned in the streets of the world, and that's the only contribution I can give you. But thanks God you have wisdom coming from my left and my right, and that will be for the better part of this program. My exposure to Iran actually never stopped even after I left the UN. I was tempted to say that there was no way one can walk out of their country once you walk in, and maybe it is true. My experience, I will touch upon briefly this morning, stems from the following negotiations in which I was very personally, sometimes too personally, involved. The first is the Iran-Iraq War and the specific negotiations which led on to the ceasefire between those two countries. The second was the hostage saga in Lebanon and the operation which eventually led to the liberation of 11 Western hostages, 6 Americans, 3 British, 2 Germans, and unfortunately also the remains of others. The third, a bit less known, I don't think I ever told John even this, but I had actually a reincarnation, which is much more recent 10 years ago. And I was actually involved in the case of the 13 Iranian Jews from Shiraz. And it was an involvement which lasted a few years, and very, very short involvement, but gave me a peep at a different time of the country, and I will touch very, very briefly accordingly, is the case of the 15 British sailors, which were detained for 12 days, as you may remember, and then released. So I will refer to this and what I've seemed to have understood of what was going on in very specific instances, and those are the 4 cases, so to speak, which I will touch upon. I will spend, of course, a little bit more time on the first 2, but to many, the 8/8/88 is just a very curious date. Of course, it was the end of the war between Iraq and Iran, and it was curious because a few months earlier, my secretary had stuck on my door this number, 8/8/88. We were working on this issue of the negotiations, and prophetically, it came to pass. I don't know where she learned this, or this magic, but it happened. The war, which had lasted for 8 years, had, of course, gone through, as you know, very different stages. what was significant in terms of negotiations, that of course by now I think everybody knows, is that the ceasefire was achieved without the presence of Iraq at the negotiating table. Iraq was not there. In fact, the Iraqi delegation who had come to New York had left 2 days earlier. But when they left, we had to come up with a solution very quickly, and carrying with me some remnants of the Renaissance from Italy, I thought that in the old days, which means half a millennium ago, there were people who used to have an interesting political role, and they were called bankers. And the bankers were financing wars and were closing wars, and I said, why don't we call the bankers? And so it happened that the Saudis came within 12 hours to New York, and they sat at the table, which was supposed to be for the Iraqis, and in fact, the end of the war was negotiated between ourselves, Prince Faisal, and in another room, Dr. Velayati. Iraq is nowhere to be seen. That, of course, is in itself, I thought, a curious way of doing things. There are those who believe that in order to negotiate, you need the two combatants, and if one leaves at the end of the negotiations, well, I suggest to use a bit of Italian imagination. Maybe you can find a way. What was interesting from the point of view of methodology, so to speak, at that time, to me, was that the state of affairs in Iran in the summer of '88 was very bleak, to say the least, very bleak indeed. And despite that, both economically and militarily, for the great victories which had been one after the other for 6.5 years had begun to disappear, and the Iraqis had militarily found some successes here and there in '88. What was interesting to me in this negotiation, Dr. Velayati told me very, very clearly that he would never accept to sit down with the Iraqis face to face before an agreement on a ceasefire. He wanted to do the agreement on a ceasefire indirectly and not directly. And I thought that was a big order, a very tall order indeed, because of the military situation and political situation in which Iran found itself. It just suffices to say that, of course, in June and July, all the various events with planes and ships happen on the waters of the Gulf, and I don't have to go through those things, and which made their position extremely, extremely difficult. But in a way, the request was rooted in something more important than facts, was rooted in what I thought it was, and I still believe it is, the national narrative. I am personally convinced that, unfortunately for us, facts usually last 1 millisecond. The moment a fact is put in our mind, it becomes something else. In different ways, is a bit like when you put petrol in your engine or food in your mouth. The moment you process it, becomes something else. So to imagine the decisions are based on facts would be to say the decisions are made in a millisecond when the facts happen, which I don't think is the case, and the narrative actually becomes, in fact, stronger. The narrative was, as we all know, that Iraq, first and foremost, was not the real enemy, but that Iraq was a puppet, and that the puppeteers were not in Iraq. And that was, in a way, in my view, one of the reasons why Dr. Velayati was in one room and Prince Faisal of Saudi Arabia was in another room, and that did not seem to be strange at all, because the Saudis were perceived to be as one of the puppeteers at least, if not the complete puppeteer. And so it fed into the narrative, and it was fairly acceptable. And indeed, that's what happened. What was unfortunately also true for the Iranians at the time is that the entire region had changed, in the last 2 years before the end of the war. And just to mention two of the major changes, I will suggest that, of course, they had come to learn that something was moving in the world, which was called the Cold War. And much before the Cold War was over, the Cold War was over. That is to say, the Cold War practically, in many respects, in some regions ended by the time people realized that Mr. Gorbachev's foreign policy was changing radically. And that was not in 91, but of course, as we know, at least by the end of 86. On the other hand, until Tariq Aziz remained in New York, which was the 6th of August, he did not ask to sit down with Velayati. He shouted about it. And I'm not using this in order to give a small anecdote. If you want to see an example of non-diplomatic behavior, you should ask me to tell you exactly what Dr. Tariq Aziz did in those 10 days or 2 weeks he was there. It was scenes which I will never forget, because if I had behaved like this at home, my family would have kicked me out. His point was, of course, he wanted a meeting with Tariq Aziz, with Velayati, in order to be able to insult him and then to report to his master that he had actually done that. And again, this was part of the narrative behind it. The real position, as we know, of Iraq at that point was to launch the offensive in the end of September, which is exactly what Tariq Aziz said when he called me on the 6th of August in the morning on the telephone in my house and say, I'm not coming to the UN building, I'm going home, I've been recalled. And the reason that, and when Riyadh said, I'll see you in October, meaning after the offensive, which we all knew they were preparing, because photographs are there to testify that. What was interesting, when eventually the ceasefire was agreed and the two delegations met in Geneva 4 weeks later, those negotiations went nowhere, as we all know. There was nothing that emerged from the several months in which the two sides, in fact for a year, they met in some way or another, so to speak, to discuss the other aspects of what should be done when people don't fight each other. Instead, what happened was that the Iranians were successful over time in, so to speak, addressing other elements of the narrative, and more specifically, the narrative of victimization without justice. As many of you will know, in the mid-80s, a book came out in Iran called The Imposed War, and in English, The Imposed War is, in fact, the translation of a sentence which is actually very well known in the Iranian narrative and in the Iranian collective imagination, the imposed war. And why it was imposed, of course, was because the narrative would say we have been aggressed. But why without justice also? Because not only we've been aggressed, the Iranians will say, but we've been aggressed, and the world does not even concede that the aggression was perpetrated and that there is no need to really adjust the case. The element of without justice I mention here because it is directly connected with the case which I was supposed to deal and I dealt with just after the end of the war between the two countries, and that was the case of the Lebanese hostages, or the hostages in Lebanon. The reason why the hostages were released eventually are, of course, multiple. I don't claim there was only one. But the deal I first set with the president of Iran, Rafsanjani, took 2.5 years to seal, not because it was difficult to seal it, because I did not know what would have clinched the deal. And that is because I'm slow. It took me a long time to understand. I tried from 1988. I never went to Beirut before 1990. I thought one should go to Beirut from the east, never from the west. And the fact that Terry Wade was in jail by then, or rather detained by by the kidnappers was another reason why I thought I would better go there from the east and from the west. But what clenched the deal with the Iranians, and my discussion with Rafsanjani started very early after the end of the war with Iraq, was very simple. And that's why I was so mad it took me so long to get it. And that was that one of the elements that the Iranians were seeking and that the world had half conceded in Resolution 589 of 1987 was the establishment of an international team that would deliberate over the, quote, responsibility of the war. Now, the responsibility of the war did not say the beginning or the continuation. It was supposed to cover both, so that both sides would be okay. One could accuse one to start, one to continue. It didn't go that way, actually. But that never happened. That particular paragraph of the resolution, like other paragraphs, were not implemented so quickly. In fact, they were not implemented at all, some of them, to this day. And so with Rafsanjani, it got me some time, but I said, why don't we set up a group of professors who will look into the responsibility of the war, and they will prepare a report. And the report is what I will give you when all the hostages are home. And I think it took Rafsanjani a matter of seconds to say, okay, let's see, when do I get the page which says that I've been aggressed? I said, you get at the end. And I'm not joking, this would happen. There were 3 people in that room when this was discussed. But it took 2.5 years to get to this point because I didn't know what was a clinching element. Of course, Saddam Hussein, in his own way, had helped dramatically the hostage situation when he went into Kuwait and opened the Kuwaiti prisons because, as we all know, the 17 Dawa prisoners from Lebanon were one of the original reasons why people were kidnapped in Lebanon. And of course, since nobody was going to release them, they were still there. But when Saddam went in, opened the door, and they left, of course, half of the problem was kind of, I thought, solved. Rafsanjani accepted this deal, and though he tried in many ways, face to face, and when we have time we can go through it if you like, he actually accepted eventually that the report will be issued after the liberation of the hostages. And this is exactly what happened. And the report came out, was written by 3 professors whose name, I swear to you, I forgot because I don't want to remember, because clear enough, not much later, the Iraqis came to me and they said, give us the names. And they were not joking. And that actually clinched the deal. And that was just a matter of execution. Again, the execution took 6 or 8 months to be done. But that was what actually happened. And that was, again, what I call another of those elements which are a little bit from left field, but which address, and I go back to that, and address at the time the Iranian narrative. It was one of the elements of the Iranian narrative. It's not a question of, who's right, who's wrong. It was a question of a narrative which was in a way also disconnected with the hostages. Now, it was interesting that there was, of course, another part of the deal, and that was, and we all know here, the famous goodwill begets goodwill, pronounced at the inaugural speech by President Bush in January 1989, and which actually launched my negotiations, because that was what gave me the possibility to move around and do something, because that existed. And again, it's curious when you go through the facts, which of course don't exist, as I just told you, that President Rafsanjani, while asking over and over what does it mean, he accepted not to ask what it meant, but to take it at face value. And one of my efforts was to tell him, you don't imagine that people say these things and have nothing behind it. So he did accept that. Unfortunately, for a number of reasons, goodwill begets goodwill did not materialize after the liberation of the American hostages. But again, the story that I will tell you about those negotiations is, for the purpose of this conversation, is the surprise to me that he was going to accept the quid pro quo at the time he would have no more control on the deal. So that the people had left Lebanon, had gone home, and he had just to wait for the goodwill of those who were paying back, so to speak, to him with the two currencies I just mentioned to you. And as it happened, one was paid back, one not. The Rafsanjani, in the dealings I had with him throughout, was and continues to be, and many define it, a very pragmatic individual. I don't find any example in my dealings with him where this word would not apply. Extremely pragmatic, extremely pragmatic. And fascinatingly enough, neither his people nor himself, during the time I dealt with him, ever anybody mentioned to me, we have to be in touch with the leader. We have to see, we have the leader and whatever. I don't remember the name leader being mentioned to me in the early 90s and the 80s, ever. Of course, when the Imam was alive, it was a different story, but the mention was in a different way. It was almost in a spiritual sense. But operationally, which was not the case when I dealt for the 13 Shirazi Jews with Khatami. There, the question of the leader did come into the picture, but again, not very strongly. The issue at the time, which, as you know, it took 3 years to take all them out, but we did succeed to take them out. But in that case, what I want to leave with you is the fact that Khatami conceived this possibility, this operation, as a way of communicating his own understanding, to me at least, of his reading of the Western narrative. And in the sense that he thought that the case of the Shirazi Jews was probably a very local case, which had become a major case out of anybody's desire. And Khatami, in a discussions I had with him as we were trying to set the frame for this situation, never had any, for instance, any problem. He knew very well that the first group to ask me to come in and help this, because of course I left the UN earlier, was the leadership of the US Jewish community. They came to ask me if I could help. And in second level, it was Prime Minister Barak himself who came and asked me if I could help out with this case. And in fact, they were the ones to whom Khatami asked me, we will help, but ask them not to start doing demonstrations in all the embassies, in front of the embassies around the world. So it was not a big request. And I have to say that both the Jewish community in America and Prime Minister Barak did cooperate fairly well on that front. So there was in a kind of quid pro quo that doesn't fit in many respects with many of the other analyses I've seen. And again, there was a great role, of course, for the head of the judiciary, but the reference to the leader as a difficulty to overcome in order for the negotiation to be approved and for the deal to be approved never really featured that much. The only time it began to feature in dramatic terms in my encounters, and I speak what I've seen as a manual worker, was only when the new president, which now is in Tehran, was elected. And then the whole story that the leader decides everything, of course, became bigger for every situation. And I mentioned, and I close here, to my knowledge, my exposure to the British 15 case is quite telling, because for 8 days, the British, as far as I know, dealt with the, so to speak, official line that goes to the president of Iran, and nothing happened. And then when they finally managed to deal in some way directly with the leader, it took 36 hours and everybody went home. So there is an evolution there, which I think is relevant in terms of negotiation. Last but not least, and I close here truly, I think, as in any country, it seems to me things change, and thanks God they do, because that's why we live interesting lives, because every day is different from the previous ones. But one thing that has changed, in my view, of going to Iran from 1983 to 2008, is that there may be in the making, and the distinguished experts here will tell me, there may be a change in the making, which is a variation on the power centers in the country. And I think that what we've been witnessing over the last 10 years, specifically in the last 10 years, is perhaps the coming to power by themselves, as a power center by itself, or by themselves, of the Revolutionary Guards. who moved from the early stages of their existence to being what they are today, the only thing missing is to be a power center by themselves. So I say this because the practical conclusion that I can do in 60 seconds, actually 30 seconds, is if it is true that I would today, tomorrow morning, I would still feature in the leader, very importantly, in any kind of negotiation one may have to have in Iran. My question is, the door of the leader, which has never been very open to the West in any case, is just ajar. The entrance probably has two names to go in, but two things that we have to factor in. Number one is not exactly 25 years old. And number two, if in this evolution the Revolutionary Guards go, so to speak, in political business by themselves, then we will no longer have the authority of the leader to be the way it is today. So the window of that door being just ajar, in my view, is very, very short. 6 months? 1 year? I don't know. And I don't know the future. But I think the change I've seen, even physically, of the Revolutionary Guards will lead me to say that instead of being just the centurions of another power, they may become the centurions of themselves and then decide to operate in different ways. And then we enter a different Iran, which we have not seen in terms of decision-making as yet. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'll now turn to Robert Lippert, please, talk on the nuclear issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hala, for inviting me to participate in today's session. What a fascinating oral history. It's a real pleasure to be on a panel with Gianni Pico, and we honor his service to the international community over decades. For the United States and Iran, the nuclear issue has been a surrogate for a broader debate in both countries about their relationship. So to address the nuclear question, let me start with the character of that broader context. At the heart of the debate in each country is an unresolved contradiction, a policy tension that has produced incoherence. And those contradictions have fed the estrangement between the two countries, which is now entering its fourth decade. In Iran, the contradiction turns on the question, is the Islamic Republic of Iran a revolutionary state or an ordinary country? For the Tehran regime, its radical foreign policy is viewed as an important source of domestic legitimation. Along with the theme of victimization that Gianni Pico mentioned, a core tenet is anti-Americanism. Relations with the great Satan has been and remains the defining foreign policy issue in Iran, in a way that relations with Iran is not the defining issue in the United States. In this country, the policy contradiction has led to competing goals and a mixed message from Washington. Is the United States' objective to change the regime in Tehran or to change its behavior? That debate was transformed by 9/11, which exposed U.S. vulnerability to a terrorist attack and led to a redefinition of threat. The Bush administration argued that the threat of the new era, the post-9/11 era, derived from the very character of our adversaries, unpredictable rogue states and undeterrable terrorist groups. This redefinition of threat led to a radical change in U.S. strategy. The Bush administration shifted from a pre-9/11 mix of deterrence and containment to an emphasis on regime change subsequently. Administration hardliners and Bush administration hardliners argued that mere behavior change would no longer suffice because the bad behavior was intimately linked to the character of the regimes. Threat was linked to character of regime. This change in perspective was captured in a response by Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld when asked why Iraq post-9/11 had become a priority. He said there was not new information, but rather that the United States now viewed Iraq, as he put it, through the prism of 9/11. And I took that as the subtitle of my book, Regime Change. After the fall of Baghdad in April 2003, the Bush administration hailed Iraq as a quote-unquote type, a new model of coercive non-proliferation via regime change. president proclaimed that the United States had redefined war through its demonstrated ability to decapitate a regime without inflicting unacceptable civilian casualties. One official declared that the message of the Iraq War for Iran was, quote unquote, take a number. The United States supports nonproliferation as a norm, as a global norm. But in practice, while supporting the norm, U.S. policy is focused on keeping weapons, as administrations phrase it, out of the wrong hands. So in concluding the nuclear agreement with India, and thereby circumventing decades of nonproliferation legislation with waivers, et cetera, the Bush administration argued that it was doing so because India was a quote-unquote responsible state. And that is an implicit contrast to irresponsible states, such as the one we're addressing today. Iran's nuclear program, what can one say about it? It's determined, it's incremental, but it's not a crash program to get a weapon as quickly as possible in the face of an existential threat. It's not Pakistan or Israel or North Korea that views nuclear weapons as the answer to their security dilemma. To the extent that Iran perceives a regime-changing threat, it arises from the United States, which during the Bush administration sent this mixed message about whether the U.S. goal was to change the regime or to change the conduct of the regime. Iranian interest in nuclear weapons is not specific to this regime, as the program began under the Shah. In 2003 testimony, head of CIA, Director of CIA George Tenet stated, quote, no Iranian government, regardless of its ideological leanings, is likely to abandon WMD programs that are seen as guaranteeing Iran's security, close quote. Iran's program is less advanced than North Korea's, but Iran is viewed as more dangerous and a more dynamic threat than North Korea. North Korea is isolated, totally absorbed with regime survival. The Iranian nuclear program is urgent because that country is on the cusp of mastering uranium enrichment technology and thereby crossing an important technological threshold. In dealing with the Iranian nuclear program, there are two options. Bluntly put, we can bomb or we can negotiate. There's a third, I suppose, acquiescence, but that's been off the table. We may get there if we won't pursue effective diplomacy and we can't bomb. Let me address that. U.S. military options are severely constrained. Such an attack would be preventive, not preemptive against an imminent threat. After the WMD fiasco in Iraq, it is particularly difficult for the United States to make the case for preventive action in Iran. Proponents of military action who want to keep it on the table often cite the Israeli raid on Osirak in June 1981 as a model, but that was a rare case in which all the conditions of success were present. Virtually none of them exist in Iran today, and indeed, a military strike would be perhaps the most telegraphed punch in history. The U.S. would face formidable military and intelligence hurdles given Iran's multiple and redundant facilities. The release of radioactive toxins from airstrikes could inflict civilian populations. There would be environmental damage. But most importantly, it would not end the program, but only set it back. And those estimates range from 6 months to 2 years. As IAEA Director General Mohammad Al-Baradei put it, you can't bomb knowledge. But even more fundamentally, in Tehran, a so-called limited U.S. airstrike, military strike on Iran's nuclear infrastructure would be viewed as the initiation of a regime-toppling war. The supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, has warned that U.S. military action would trigger major Iranian retaliation against U.S. interests worldwide, starting in Iraq. And if one looks at how decision memos are teed up for the President of the United States, under the con side, a non-trivial con is action may trigger general war in region. And we should make no mistake about it. The morning after the airstrikes on Iran, the United States is at war with Iran, and the Iranian people, which some proponents of military action view as being ripe for a popular uprising against the regime, would more likely rally around the flag of the clerics against the United States. If the military option is constrained, the diplomatic alternative is at an impasse. Ahmadinejad's radical foreign policy, compounding his economic mismanagement, has generated a domestic backlash from reformists and pragmatic conservatives who want to retain Iran's right to civil nuclear energy but are open to a nuclear deal. U.S. regime change rhetoric during the Bush administration strengthened the hardliners who could point to it as the rationale for a bomb. Over the last 30 years, the United States has episodically been interested in engaging Iran, but two patterns have emerged. First, what is politically possible in Washington is politically insignificant in Tehran. Case in point, 2000, lifting of sanctions on pistachios and carpets. That is not a signal that's going to get attention in a foreign capital. Secondly, as a consequence of its mixed message over the objective, the United States has missed opportunities and paid the price. One episode that's been much discussed was the spring 2003 fax through the Swiss to the administration, the provenance of which is debated. But the point is that 2 years before Ahmadinejad's election and before centrifuges were spinning in Iran, there was an opening that the Bush administration, at the point of maximum hubris, with this take-a-number rhetoric, was not interested in exploring. We've now had, if I may put it this way, regime change in Washington, and a new president who is offering a different approach to dealing with Iran. And one slogan that has been put forward is better carrots, better sticks. Now, what would that mean? How could we translate that slogan into a coherent strategy? And here, one would point to the important precedent of 2003, not Iraq, but Libya, an important precedent in two respects. First, the Bush administration made clear that it was willing to take yes for an answer, that if Gaddafi underwent verifiable, transparent WMD disarmament, that the United States would fall off of regime change as an objective. In the absence of that core condition, Gaddafi's incentive would have been to hit the gas on the programs. If he'd believed the U.S. was going to try to change the regime, regardless of any change in Libyan conduct, he would have had an incentive to hit the gas on the programs to get his own deterrent. The Libyan precedent is important in a second respect that's been less noted in our public debate, and that is what prompted Gaddafi's strategic turn. And that strategic turn dates not to 2003, but to the mid-1990s, when the combination of multilateral sanctions and the collapse of the oil price was squeezing important regime interests in Tripoli. And in their in the meetings of the leadership, there were two factions, so-called technocrats and radicals, and there was a stark choice. Would Libya undergo the changes that would lift the sanctions? And that was the beginning of the strategic turn that culminated in the December 2003 agreement. It was a combination of pressure on key regime interests in tandem with a clear communication that the United States was willing to take yes for an answer. And that's the approach that would be applicable as we now think about a possibility of formulating a new approach to Iran. When I worked on the NSC in the mid-90s on the North Korean case, a colleague of mine put it nicely in the context of North Korea, saying, North Korea does not respond to pressure, but without pressure, North Korea does not respond. And I think we need to create a similar dynamic in the context of Iran. How to increase pressure on the regime, core regime interests, what they value, the financing of leadership, whatever that would be identified to be, in tandem with a willingness to take yes for an answer. Now, what are the practical possibilities on the nuclear question? Iranian mastery of uranium enrichment technology really calls into the question whether verifiable disarmament through negotiations is possible. The mastery of uranium enrichment, what Stephen Hadley called the long pole in the tent after the publication of the 2007 National Intelligence Estimate, has given Iran a hedge option. The ability to hedge its bets, and to go for weaponization if circumstances led it to pursue that option. Indeed, in the absence of an urgent threat, Iran may well choose to continue a nuclear hedge strategy indefinitely. Given the possible regional reaction to an overt nuclear Iran, it might serve Iran's interests. Former President Rafsanjani told our colleague George Perkovich at the Carnegie Endowment in 2005, quote, "As long as we can enrich uranium and master the nuclear fuel cycle, we don't need anything else. Our neighbors will be able to draw the proper conclusions." So the prognosis here is a hedge strategy. It is ambiguity. The U.S. can realistically aim through negotiations to narrow that ambiguity. For example, capping the Natanz facility. That would be a plausible, good outcome. But U.S. diplomacy cannot realistically strive to eliminate that ambiguity because Iran has mastered the uranium enrichment technology. You can't bomb knowledge, and probably there'll be an outcome with some centrifuges still spinning. So let me conclude where I began, with the core contradictions in Iranian and U.S. policies. Taking regime change off the table in Washington, as President Obama has stated that he will do, could put behavior change on the table in Tehran. We need to sharpen the contradiction. If the United States can remove the contradiction in our policy over what the objective is, it will tee up what Tom Friedman has called an excruciating choice in Tehran. And that's what our policy should aim to do in its broadest context. Force them to make a choice. Is Iran a revolutionary state or an ordinary country? Such a strategy does not guarantee success, but it is a condition for success. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Robbie.
Thank you, Hale. I'm honored to be on this panel. My assignment was to figure out how we chart a diplomatic course for the future that takes into account a very messy past. And I think this is a unique moment. Never in the 30 years of the Iranian Revolution have you had a time when the two capitals were on the same wavelength. When you look back, the last 5 American presidents have found Iran is the singular stymie to foreign policy ambitions. Carter, Reagan, and Bush 1, Iran was the biggest embarrassment or humiliation or failure in foreign policy. For Bush 2, he took a country that was fragile and helped make it the superpower of the region. It's a very refreshing shift. Too often we've been going in opposite directions from each other, and when one side turned and went the other direction, the other side just turned and went in the opposite one. And this was, in my mind, most symbolized by Iran's offer in the mid-1990s to Conoco to help develop a major petroleum deal. It would have provided tens of thousands of jobs in the United States, and the Clinton administration responded by imposing new sanctions and cutting off all oil purchases, even on the free market. There were only 2 times, I think, that we actually ended up dealing with each other on substantive issues, and they both emerged out of crises that the two countries faced. One was in the mid-1980s during the Iran arms for hostage swap, when Iran wanted arms to fight against Iraq, and the United States wanted to free American hostages in Lebanon. And it turned out to be a disaster for both sides, or only a short-term solution anyway. In 2001, during the crisis over Afghanistan, Iran and the United States cooperated in very significant ways in creating a new government to replace the Taliban. And this, I think, was another one of these lost opportunities that Rob and Johnny referred to. In contrast to the past 30 years, I think you see language in both Tehran and Washington that indicates a strong interest in pursuing dialogue. We've heard that even from President Ahmadinejad. And again, President Obama signaled it just this week in his speech to Congress when he talked about signaling in words and deeds that the U.S. has begun a new era of engagement. And he said the United States cannot shun the negotiating table nor ignore the forces or foes that could do harm to the United States. And he said he pledged that the United States would move ahead with confidence and candor that reflect the serious times that we face. The United States also this week appointed a new special advisor to deal with the question of the Persian Gulf and Southwest Asia. Southwest Asia has apparently become the new euphemism for Iran. So the question is, now that we've decided what we're going to try to do, the question is how to do it. And I think based on the past tensions of the last 3 decades, we'll probably go through at least 5 different stages. The first is going to be the initial contacts and statement of general goals. And in this context, I think it'd be very smart to frame our goals in terms of Iran's concern and to emphasize the differences from the past, particularly the immediate past with the Bush administration. Fundamentally, the debate in Iran, or the debate in Washington, boils down to whether to engage in carrots and sticks, or to focus on just the idea of engagement. Dennis Ross, the new special advisor on Southwest Asia, did an article in Newsweek in which he talked about more appetizing carrots and sharper sticks. I've thought about this a lot, and I think that a strategy of framing our policy for the future on the basis of carrots and sticks would probably backfire for at least 3 reasons. The first is Iran will say, as it's already indicated, that this is just more of the same, and will confirm the skepticism and the arguments of those who are opposed to engagement with the United States. The key players, including Russia and China, will probably not go along with more sanctions at this stage. They already believe there's enough in place, and that could undermine the idea of sharper sticks and leave the Obama administration looking very much like the Bush administration did in its final months. And third, I think the Obama administration probably doesn't need new sticks yet. There are already a host of sanctions on the books. And the dangers to Iran, finally, are quite implicit. Iran knows what happens when diplomacy fails, when initiatives crumble, and when and what the possibilities are. We've made that clear over the past 30 years. So again, it's how you frame it. It doesn't mean appeasing Iran. It doesn't mean giving up on the idea of sanctions or punitive action short of military strikes down the road. It's just how you frame the discussion. And I think that has a lot to do with kind of the psychology of diplomacy. Now, in terms of how and when you do things, Hale had a very good suggestion in a couple of forums in the past week, and that is to deal with Iran, begin sending your first message, engage, framing the context of what you're trying to achieve in Nowruz, the Persian New Year, which happens in 3 weeks, in language that accepts Iran's historic contributions and current importance, but goes beyond the kind of message the Bush administration used to send on Nowruz, in looking forward to working with Iran's current government. That gets beyond the talk of regime change and implies that we accept this government, and also emphasizes the desire to cooperate and not confront, which would in many ways take the idea of military action off the table. The second phase is confidence building, and again, there are lessons from the past. And again, I think something new is needed here. President Khatami in 1997 talked about bringing down the wall of mistrust and engaging in cultural exchanges. I covered a lot of those as a journalist. I went to Stillwater, Oklahoma, where you have the Hall of Fame wrestling center and watched Iranian wrestlers compete with Americans, and I've seen American basketball players in Iran. I think it's time to move way beyond that kind of exchange. I don't mean abandon it, I just think it's time to think bigger and more imaginatively, and more creatively. And I think this is, again, where you can look at the sore points of the past to try to frame what you do next. And I tried to come up with some examples. These are not necessarily the best ideas, but to kind of reflect how we take that idea. There's not much the United States can do about 1953, which is a sore point when the CIA and British intelligence engaged in toppling a popularly elected government and putting the Shah back on the throne. But there is another juncture that is very sensitive in Iran, and that is from the Iran-Iraq War, when the United States helped in the final stages of that war, providing intelligence to Iraq that was used against Iran, and intelligence used that involved Iraq using chemical weapons on some of those Iranian deployments. After the war, the CIA estimated that there were at least 50,000 casualties from the use of chemical weapons by Iraq between 1982 and 1988. I went back in 2002, 3 months before the U.S. invasion, and found that chemical weapons is still a profound issue of concern in Iran, in part because doctors now estimate that there are over 100,000 casualties from chemical weapons due to something called low-dose exposure, and that is troops or civilians who are far from the front lines of a conflict, but because of streams that were near the war front that ended up carrying chemicals, that the people in the late 1990s and the early parts of this century began developing symptoms. And this is a place where you take experts perhaps from the National Institute of Health to deal with the Iranian Ministry of Health on an issue of common concern, to collect data that would be of interest to both sides, to explore the impact and the possible kinds of treatments. There are a few places, and I can't think of any place in the last half century where there's a greater lab for the use of chemical weapons and their impact. And it's not just a confidence-building mechanism. It provides useful data for both sides, something tangible, and sets the precedent for dealing with the issue of weapons of mass destruction. It's different from nuclear, but it's one that deals with the most pressing issue for our interest. Another issue is to go back to the idea of the Conoco deal from the mid-1990s, because Iran has deep concerns about its energy needs and wants to develop South Pars, the South Pars gas field, which is the largest in the world. The Qatar side of that is off and running because it allowed foreign investment and foreign technology and foreign deals. The Iranian side of that field is still largely undeveloped. And this is a place, Iran also imports 40% of its oil today because it doesn't have adequate refineries. So another idea is to encourage experts, analysts, oil companies to talk to Iran about its energy needs, to come up with a wish list. That doesn't mean we're going to deliver them immediately. It's just what business we could do under the right circumstances. And frankly, the minute there's a U.S.-Iran dialogue going, every oil company in the world is going to be back talking to its counterparts, trying to put in place memos of understanding. This then allows American companies to be part of that process, so we're not excluded down the road. Again, it offers something tangible, creates a sense of incentives, and signals that the United States is looking to a future of real engagement on lots of levels and a future together. The third idea is to deal with the problems of the Gulf. In 1988, the USS Vincennes shot down an Iranian passenger aircraft, killing almost 300 people. There have been a number of different incidents in the Gulf between Iranian and U.S. naval ships. And the idea is to basically set up some kind of mechanism. We had the red phone with the Soviets during the Cold War, to set up something kind of on a local, whether it's with the fleet based in Bahrain, or to have some kind of, something with CENTCOM and Qatar, some kind of mechanism so that when we have this incident, we don't have to rely on what happens offshore. We can have an instant way of contacting them. I think this is something the military would be very interested in on both sides. The third phase in new diplomacy is defining the agenda. The top two issues for the United States are regional issues and the nuclear. The second tier issues are terrorism and the Mideast conflict. For Iran, the top two issues are security and the economy, and the second tier issues are Iran's regional role and the U.S. military presence. The goal, as you define the agenda, is clearly to come up with areas of commonality rather than the greatest confrontation. And to begin, I think you have to look at common regional concerns. It's the area where there's the greatest potential and the greatest concern, shared concern. And again, this involves Afghanistan and Iraq. And again, trying to come up with ideas, not suggesting they're the best ideas, but just to give you a flavor of the kinds of things. Washington and Tehran in the past have shared a deep concern about the Taliban. The only country or the only political movement that Iran feared more than the United States and Israel was the Taliban on its border. They also shared a common concern in the past on the growing narcotics industry in Afghanistan that have undermined their own societies. And finally, they shared the fears of the dangers of a failed state on their broader strategic interests in the region. Now, when you look at Afghanistan, this is, how do you find means of cooperating? And I heard an interesting story the other day, and I did a little Google search on it. NPR did a piece about how pomegranates, cultivating pomegranates, has become an alternative to poppy cultivation in Afghanistan. And one of the interesting facts is that an Afghan farmer can make $2,000 per acre with pomegranates versus $1,300 for poppies. Now, the United States has looked into this, and there are lots of limitations, particularly when it comes to the issue of security. But given the popularity of pomegranates, particularly in this country, in everything from drinks to salads, this is one of those things that you think maybe there's actually a possibility here. And there are a few countries in the world that are as expert at either producing or consuming pomegranates than Iran. On Iraq, it's a small step, but again, a lot of this is going to have to be looking for common ground rather than areas of long-standing confrontation. On Iraq, again, there's a potential area for some kind of cooperation diplomatically, and that's on the looming conflict in the northern city of Kirkuk between the Kurds and the Arabs. This is worrisome not only for our desire for stability, but also for Iran's. It has a large Kurdish population, 4 to 6 million people. It doesn't want to see a friendly Shiite government in Baghdad engaged in a conflict with Kurdistan that could spill over into its own role. And this is a place where you could actually get some kind of discussion on trying to prevent Kirkuk from becoming a really destabilizing, ultimately even the most destabilizing factor in the new Iraq. All of these things can happen under U.S. auspices. There are forums or agencies that deal with whether it's agriculture in Afghanistan or Kirkuk in Iraq. The fourth phase begins as confidence building takes root and cooperation begins on issues of common concern. And this opens the way for diplomacy on the more sensitive issues, notably on the nuclear question. And Rob's gone over that very thoughtfully. At at some point, obviously, we're going to have to encourage Iran so that diplomacy can take a real route to try to freeze its program. In other words, it doesn't have to give it up, but to go back to the idea of a freeze while diplomacy takes root. After you've established that things are possible, then you get into the phase, okay, let's deal with the most sensitive issue. This is a time, I think, that discussions can begin to develop on a bilateral basis and move for the first time to Tehran and to Washington, where you have interlocutors that don't have to rely on international agencies. And Rob pointed out there is a pattern already established with Libya of how you go through the phases. Again, perhaps it's not just an intersection. I think that's interesting, but an intersection really only deals with consular issues, not substance between the two countries. And again, this is where you open commercial ties, commercial office. China was, again, a model of how you restore relations. But this is, again, to signal that we're moving beyond the past and that this is the stage where you establish the foundation for the future. And the fifth and final phase is when you really get to the agreements, and we're so far away from that. I don't want to frame, what form they're going to take. We all know what the issues are. The last thing I really want to mention is the timing of this, because I think that there are going to be some limitations, not just because of the different clocks they're running in Iran and Washington, the nuclear clock and how fast Iran may be able to develop a nuclear weapons capability, and then the slow pace of sanctions in squeezing Iran to the point that it will feel that it has no alternative but to cooperate. I think there's some other factors in here that will force the Obama administration's hand, and I think the most pressing one is our very own election timetable. That I think we have a year to get something going, to get something established. The first three phases, getting through at least into the third phase in a significant way, perhaps not wrapping it up. Because with the election cycle, we all know that the congressional elections are in 2 years, that Iran could well be, particularly if a year from now you have the number of centrifuges required, nothing tangible, that there will be enormous pressure, and it can be used as an election issue in a way that because there hasn't been progress, because there isn't something, that Iran still has an enrichment program, it's only frozen perhaps, or it's maybe not even there, that this could backfire and put the kind of pressure that the Clinton administration faced. It didn't want to put new sanctions on in the mid-1990s, but because Congress was moving to impose new sanctions, the Clinton administration preempted Congress and put milder sanctions than Congress imposed, but still not things that they really favored doing because there was pressure. And we have to remember that it's not just the executive branch that makes foreign policy. Particularly on these sensitive issues, Congress weighs in heavily too. And finally, I think, to conclude, that the United States is going to be successful, is going to have to deal not just with Iran, that for the first time we're going to have to not only chew gum and walk at the same time, we're also going to need to lift weights while we're doing it. We're going to have to create a sense of momentum on Arab-Israeli so that the Iran-Hamas and Iran-Hezbollah relationships don't derail things. And also, we're going to have to move very deliberately on the Syria track. And that does not mean concessions in any way. It just means that there's often talk about having one priority. What's the road to peace? Is it via Baghdad? Is it via Damascus? Is it via Tehran? And I think that we're going to find that we're going to have to move on all fronts, that things have deteriorated to such a point in the region that we can't act on one without dealing with the other two at the same time. Thank you.
Thank you, Robin. John, please.
Thank you, Holly, and thank you, the other panelists who have put a lot of good ideas on the table. My first appeal is to turn off the air conditioning as possible, in light of the new realities of a green economy in my throat. I'm developing a somewhat bolder diplomatic approach in a white paper for the New Ideas Fund, and which I will make available to everyone here if they want it within a month or so. And I'll just summarize very quickly what the elements of that approach will be. And today I'll address three things. First, the failure of current policy, recent policy, I should say, and some of the other panelists have done a pretty good job on this, so I'll try to be even more concise on that. Secondly, the uncertain prospects for gradualism as an approach to Iran, and then third, a new and bolder approach to transforming the relationship. On the first, which I generally think of as being coercion, the failure of coercion, I think, scarcely needs restating, but I think it is certainly the case that it has been U.S. policy for most of the last 30 years in one form or another, with very few variations along the way. And today, Iran is stronger as a regional player than at any time in those 3 decades. It has strong commercial ties with China, Japan, India, and many in Europe. It is broadly regarded as a leader in the Muslim world. It has gotten to this point despite a history of U.S. sanctions and pressure and isolation, military intimidation, despite the long war with Iraq, despite the turbulence in Afghanistan, which you'll recall in the 80s and 90s sent more than 2 million refugees into Iran, despite the collapse of the Soviet Union and the turbulence of the former Soviet republics on Iran's borders, and Iran's own missteps economically, politically, and socially. So despite endless predictions of its imminent demise, the Iranian state appears today to be ever more robust, partially democratic, and largely legitimate in the eyes of most of its population. So coercion does not seem to be the right policy, and yet many in Washington persist with coercion as the primary focus of U.S. policy. And I think Robin and others have pointed out the carrots and sticks analogy, or use of carrots and sticks language, and how damaging and counterproductive that kind of approach and language is. And there's I think a good summary quotation from the most recent Luers, Pickering, and Walsh article in the New York Review of Books, which is, Iranians bristle at the use of the phrase carrots and sticks, which they associate with the treatment of donkeys, and which in any case suggests that they can be either bought off or beaten into submission. And I think that really needs to be repeated, this criticism of carrots and sticks over and over again, because Obama himself has used it more than once. Biden said something recently that suggested something along the same lines, and of course, as Robin pointed out, the new special advisor has used that language repeatedly. So that the sticks part of it, which is always the more prominent aspect, a reward structure in which if you don't do what we want you to do, we're going to beat you with sticks. That kind of reward structure needs to be rethought very carefully, because it hasn't worked in the past. It's not likely to work in the future, no matter how many nice words are otherwise said. And in fact, a number of scholars have pointed out that compellence and coercion rarely actually does work in international relations, in a very, very small minority of cases. So moving on to a very brief questioning rather than criticism of gradualism. I'm afraid some of the things that Robin has just suggested, but I want to put this in the context of not saying that gradualism or gradual steps, small steps, confidence-building measures are worthless. Quite the contrary. I think that confidence-building measures and various kinds of signaling are very useful, especially initiating a change in the relationship. But what I argue here is that they're not sufficient to carry the relationship to the next stage. They're necessary in nearly any diplomatic initiative. They can range from opening up commercial opportunities for each country's businesses to lightening visa procedures to cultural and athletic exchanges and the like. They can be used as signaling maneuvers in which, for example, country A declines to criticize country B for an action that would previously have earned criticism. The problem with small steps is that they can be misunderstood or overlooked. And a long series of small steps, particularly if they are not instantly recognized as such and reciprocated, can provide additional ammunition for spoilers. That is, if you envision a period of 2 or 3 years of gradually warming relations built on signals and small steps and reciprocation, always with this sort of this threat of sticks in the background, I'm afraid that there's too many opportunities for misinterpretation on the other side, for missed signals, and indeed for a kind of rejectionism based on a misunderstanding. We've seen that happen so many times in the U.S.-Iran relationship. Most of you are familiar with the attempts during the second Clinton term, Khatami's first term, of some gestures, some small steps that generally were missed or were misinterpreted, were conveyed in ways that the other side thought was inappropriate. And we can go into the details of that. They're pretty widely known. Some of them even becoming sort of comical at a certain point. I think Secretary of State not recognizing or a failure to recognize a diplomat at the UN in an arranged meeting, a handshake that was supposed to happen that didn't happen, and so on. I mean, this is just sort of legion, almost legendary stories now, not even rising to the level of the 2003 letter, but many, many small things that simply did not work. And I'm afraid that we might be moving on that track again. Another thing, and this is more about the language of this kind of incrementalism, is that we tend in this country to describe the need for better relations with Iran purely in terms of U.S. national interests. Now, no politician can proceed in international relations without first appealing to national interests. This is understood. But it can be taken too far, because of describing a diplomatic approach only as a way to further U.S. interests is not likely to resonate well in Iran. Diplomacy should encompass other countries' perceptions of what is important to them to produce a win-win outcome and mutually beneficial process to continue to improve the relationship. So we need to be mindful of how we frame a diplomatic approach in a period of in an earlier period. I think actually Robin made some good comments on that. And third, this sort of, again, sort of in the language of gradualism or incrementalism, there tends to be a mindset that diplomacy is kind of a last resort, or it's kind of, we're going to try diplomacy for a while, but if diplomacy doesn't work, then we're going to move to other measures. And I think that this is important to recognize as something that continues to be a framing that is threatening to Iran, not far from the kind of overt threats that have been made in the past. And I include in these the common, almost totemic phrase now that all options are on the table. I mean, that's a phrase that everybody knows what it means. It's nonsense. The U.S. military is not going to agree to any military action against Iran for a very long time, and for very good reasons. Iraq and Afghanistan being the two most prominent ones. And although Iran must recognize at some level that these are essentially empty threats for the time being, nevertheless, I think they set the wrong context, the wrong frame for moving toward a better relationship. So what then is a different, more promising approach that does not rely wholly on the rewards or coercion structure. I propose a kind of transformational diplomacy that has four main elements. First is a new language of dialogue, and we've discussed this to some extent, but I think it's important to restate because even I think an Obama administration, which seems to have good intentions, doesn't seem to be getting this right so far. The United States has for many years used patronizing and even demeaning language with reference to Iran, usually without exception. It has described Iran as a rogue state, a terrorist state, non-democratic, abusive to its own citizens, hell-bent on developing nuclear weapons, aggressive toward its neighbors, anti-Semitic, the primary cause of violence in Iraq, and so on and so on. With only minor modifications, this rhetoric has not really changed for years, and it's time that it did. The sensibilities of the Iranians is only one reason to alter our speech. The charges are significantly exaggerated in many cases. The United States has diplomatic relations and open trade with Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Russia, China, and others who could be criticized along the same lines. And as a result, the language and actions reserved for Iran are particular and in this sense seem hypocritical. The constant references to all options on the table, as I was mentioning a moment ago, just trumps all this negative language. Most significance, I think, is recognizing in a new language of dialogue Iran's security interests, their legitimate security interests. The encirclement of Iran by nuclear states and deployments, the covert actions on Iranian soil, and the threats of further military action all feed a sense of siege. Iran's history is one of repeated dominance by outside powers, and the encirclement sets off historical memories and grievances which cut very deep in the political culture. The neglect or intentional disrespecting of Iran's security interests is more than a matter of rhetorical missteps. It amounts to a misunderstanding of Iran's intentions and expectations, a very poor basis for U.S. strategy. Iran's calculations about its own security are such that the repeated threats of action, covert action during the Bush administration by Israel, for example, may be driving it to a maximalist response. So in this light, I think the change of rhetoric should include expressions of respect for Iran's civilization and its sovereignty, an end to patronizing language, a suspension of implied threats, a routine acknowledgement of Iran's security interests, and an acknowledgement of past U.S. mistakes, not necessarily rising to the level of an apology. This, of course, is a big topic I'm not going to engage right now. But repeatedly, Ahmadinejad and others in Iran have made reference to the need for the United States to apologize for the various things we've already brought up. And I think some acknowledgement of that history would be prudent. Second, I believe that we should lift sanctions quickly and unilaterally, not including UN sanctions that have to do with the nuclear development issue, which is a separate issue and I think needs to be discussed separately. But the economic sanctions imposed on Iran have taken many forms over 3 decades. They have not really worked as intended and are counterproductive. The biggest, most tangible step President Obama could make in improving the relationship is to suspend the sanctions that are unilateral. Much can be done by U.S. action alone, and some of it can be done administratively. Such action would back the new language of dialogue with consequential measures that have genuine significance for ordinary citizens in Iran. Lifting sanctions with assurances that new sanctions would not be imposed for some number of years would encourage businesses to establish new ties and start the kinds of relationships, trade linkages, that frequently promote better relations across societies. One key to success in greater commercial ties is to promote symmetry. Iranians are justly wary of dependence on U.S. goods and services, a sentiment born in the Pahlavi era and one of the principal reasons for an opposition to an opening. Khamenei and others have stated this almost explicitly. So we need to avoid a gold rush mentality on the part of some U.S. business sectors, which could create a backlash, and to take a measured approach that signals good intentions apart from money-making. Too much too fast can upset the relationship as much as too little too slowly. Third, we need to normalize relations, and to do so quickly, not use it as a reward, but to use it as an instrument of better relationship. The absence of formal diplomatic ties to Iran is an absurdity. This huffy response to the Islamic Revolution undercuts U.S. interests and general cooperation every day through the lack of reliable channels of communication. And I would say that progress on the nuclear issue would possibly be enhanced or dependent even on normal diplomatic channels. And again, just reiterating the many examples of missed opportunities in the past, many of those missed opportunities were because we did not have diplomatic relations with Iran. It was about trying to get a letter from one leader to another. And it's just, I think it is an absurdity that we don't have simply normal communication channels from one state to the other. It doesn't endorse anything they do. It doesn't endorse what is going on in other countries with which we have diplomatic ties, and it tends to just gum things up without with not having the normalization tends to gum things up. Finally, I would simply state again the need for ending threats, not only rhetorically, which I mentioned earlier, but actual disavowal of military actions, including covert actions, not threatening, not planning for military strikes, and disavowal of regime change, including ending programs like the so-called democratization program that appear to be soft power measures to engineer regime change in Iran. By going beyond the reward structure, the we demand and you must respond for us to proceed mechanism, the United States with Iran can recreate their relationship rather quickly and productively. An open-ended quality of U.S. actions, expecting but not demanding reciprocation, would comprise truly transformational diplomacy, reducing or eliminating the major sources of division, accounting for the difficult history of the two countries' interaction, forging normal diplomatic channels of communication, and building trust. The process unfolds over many months with plenty of opportunities to gauge Iran's response and the evolution of its interests. It immediately sets in motion other social and economic processes that can build links and provide forward movement. And it is essentially risk-free. It would likely benefit both Israeli security and our efforts to prevent nuclear proliferation. And I think we need to start before the election in June, and we can start with small steps but move very quickly to these bolder initiatives. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. We'll open the floor to questions and comments. My first question is going to be to Mr. Pico. You have negotiated with the Iranian leadership more than anybody, I think, in this room. We have heard all along from the panel what the United States should be doing. What should Iran do to also show its goodwill, its interest that it wants to negotiate with the United States, engage? And what are, in your opinion, the possible steps that the Iranian leadership can take, having in mind the conservative wings, the revolution regards, you pointed at the ultimate decision maker, the leader. So can you elaborate a little bit on that, and then the other panelists can comment on that, because it takes really two to tango, not one. I mean, we just sit here and say the United States should do A, B, C, D, E, F, G, but what about the other side?
Well, I'm tempted to say, if I can elaborate, the answer is no, I can't, because I don't know how to guess. I think I'll share a couple of observations with you on this impossible question. And they would be the following. The first one is that what is possible in what I've seen in my life has a lot to do, as I said earlier, with this narrative that we carry with us. But also has a lot to do with the individuals you have in front of you. There is a tendency in describing the geopolitics that we live in a world where we have structures, institutions, which is true. But, and I think this was even true, of course, during the Cold War, and that there was no room for the individuals to make a little difference. I found that this is not so, and that if the individual in front of you actually has a bit of zest and imagination, things can happen that are not necessarily what you can plan in a very structured way. Now, I think what Iran is probably facing now, like everybody else, is an incredibly changing region, which in practical terms I like to describe as follows. Until the Iranian narrative, I think, was for some time a narrative which included the concept of encirclement. We have been encircled by the West, we have been encircled by the Americas. Fascinating concept. You may be, in fact, more prepared than myself to tell me this is true or not, but I had the sense that paradoxically, after 2003, when one could actually argue on the map that some kind of encirclement was there, the Iranian narrative drops the encirclement concept. And if you look at the last couple of years, it's nowhere to be found. Why? Because the region has changed so much that Iran has simply become more influential. And therefore the encirclement does not have the same weight in the narrative. So, all I'm sorry to say to you that I think what any country which has undergone a revolution comes to a point where the revolution is over. Now, usually this does not come with one decision one day. It's a question of generations. So my hope is that the generation that the current president and the group of people that he represents, who I believe were not very happy with the idea that the revolution was over, may not be the majority, and that the country would go further and say, okay, we've had this revolution, which is great, fine, whatever happened, and now we are in a new stage. You don't have to put this on the newspaper's titles, and that, I think, would allow easier relationship with the neighbors and with others. And I think that relationship has, in some way, already evolved, and anybody in this room knows quite as anybody else that the relationship with the neighbors, especially with Saudi Arabia, has gone from here to here, from 1980s to today. So what I think the Iranians may find useful is to use individuals on their foreign policy network, so to speak, are able to project the image. We are not we're not slaves of the revolution. We have done it, and now we go further. There's more to go. Maybe a second revolution, maybe a third one, who knows? But to go further. Because I think at the moment, all the problems we are talking about here at this table seems to go back to the roots of the country, which may not be moving that much.
Okay, thank you, Robin. What should the Iranian do? Yes.
Oh,
Sure.
I'm not sure I have much to contribute. I may know a little bit more in a month because I'm hoping to go to Iran in a few days. My sense is that the Iranians, that this regime, and I do think it's important that we try not to in any way influence the election, and in fact do whatever it takes in signaling we want to talk to the Iranians before the election so that we're not seen to be weighing in on the side of Khatami. There are already suspicions that we have a favorite outcome and maybe doing things to promote it. I think we have to make sure that we are not seen to be doing that. But I do think there is some flexibility in Iran when it comes to the non-nuclear issues. I think as has been clear all along, the breakdown is, and this is I defer to Rob, I think they're willing to cooperate on Iraq, even and Afghanistan, under the right circumstances, that there's more room for regional concerns, regional issues on their borders than any place else. But I don't think they're going to give up on uranium enrichment. I think that we're going to have to bite the bullet in some form on that issue. And I don't know whether that means encouraging more monitors. But that's one area that I think the Iranians probably won't give us what we want.
Rob?
I wanted to comment on that question and more broadly. The argument I made was that the United States should present Iran with a structured choice, with a real upside and a real downside. And the prerequisite for that is clarifying that the objective of U.S. policy is not to change the regime. Now, I take the point about cultural sensitivity and carrots and sticks and the donkey. I wrote a book on rogue states critiquing the term because it got in the way of differentiated policies towards these countries, and that the United States should focus on not a unilateral American conception, but rather on complying with the norms of international relations. But when one talks about overheated rhetoric, and I'm all in favor of the United States clarifying its message, it's hard to beat death to America, okay? And Iran can have a nuclear weapons program, or it can say death to America. But if you're an American president, Iran can't say death to America and have a nuclear weapons program. And the way in which the structured choice should be framed should be clarifying that the objective is not to change the regime, but to build a coalition that will impose real costs on the Iranian regime if they do not comply with international norms, which they've been in contravention of with respect to their nuclear program. In addition to the problem over regime change, the Bush administration squandered political capital with Russia on ballistic missile defense in Eastern Europe, etc. There's a real opportunity, and I differ with Robin's take on sanctions, to go to the Russians and the Chinese now, who were more angry with the United States over issues like ballistic missile defense and how we went into Iraq, to the point where they undercut sanctions that would impede a nuclear program on their periphery. I think we have the ability to go back to them now and test the proposition. But it has to be a structured choice, and whether we call it carrots and sticks, ditch it. There have to be consequences for non-compliance with the norms of international system. And that, of course, means the United States has to comply with those norms as well, which we've not during the Bush administration, but the whole point of the Obama election, change we can believe in, is to revert back to what had been traditionally the winning strategy for American foreign policy after World War II, which was the embedding of American power in the institutions and the norms of the system. That way we can get others to go along with us.
But don't misrepresent what I said. I didn't say not to impose new sanctions. I said I think the language at the moment, it's clear that if there is not agreement or movement, that there will be further punitive action taken. sanctions and, the tightening of the belt on a lot of different fronts. I just said, I think that when you make the initial overture that you have to talk about engagement and kind of ditch the language that doesn't get us any place short term.
John, do you want to?
Well, I wish I knew how the Iranians will react to.
But what should they do?
Well, what they should do. Well,
we just keep on saying we should do this ABCD. But what should they do?
Certainly, well, it depends on what we do, of course. But there are a number of indications that they are ready to deal, if you want to put it that way. They're ready to talk. They're ready to negotiate. And it's not just based on the 2003 letter. It's also based on, a calculation of interests. It's based on on some language that's coming out of government leaders there and political leaders, and the change. I think Johnny was right that there is a changed regional context that it's not always easy to sort out, but it certainly has changed over the last 6 years to Iran's benefit, but maybe that's a good thing when it comes to their own perceptions of security. What we would like to see from them, obviously, is an earnest engagement on the nuclear issue. And there are many proposals out there that are not about them walking back to zero enrichment, which is not going to happen. I would endorse the Luers-Pickering-Walsh idea about internationalizing the enrichment process as a possible face-saving gesture for Iran to move towards something that we would consider to be acceptable. But my point is that you do the other things first that improve the relationship, lower the level of threat or insecurity, possibly lower the level of rhetoric on the other side as well, and then we can move toward much more productive relations on the things that we really care about, nuclear nonproliferation probably being the most prominent one. So one hopes that there's a willingness and an interest in moving forward with the United States if the United States acts in this way.
Malcolm, can you wait for the mic, please? Yeah.
Thanks for a terrific panel. It's really great to hear such concrete ideas. If we're going to look to the past for some possible answers, it seems ironic and even tragic that maybe the high point in U.S.-Iran relations in recent history was back at the end of World War II, when the U.S. helped to push the Russians out of Iran. And I wonder if that suggests an avenue of cooperation. It's certainly a theme that has continued through since the revolution with the other great Satan, or the other Satan, however great, and even as recent as a conversation I had with an Iranian diplomat last year who indicated that it was time for the U.S. and Iran to cooperate in limiting Russia's influence in the region. How widely held an opinion do you think that is in Iran, and how viable a route is that? Question for all the panelists.
Well, I wouldn't revive the Cold War in order to solve the Iran problem. It's we have a Russia policy problem which has its own tortured history, and I think with the Obama administration, there's a chance to get that back onto a sound footing, and wouldn't go into that. I think enough said.
Does anybody?
Well, I think continuing. Without a major change in U.S.-Iran policy, you do open the door toward a kind of Russia. This isn't the right language, but I can't think of anything else. Russia sort of capturing Iran as an ally, basically. And the United States faces a real problem if you think about great power politics, of the diffusion of power in the world. And we don't need to keep making more enemies. and especially what is otherwise a very pro-American population in Iran, all the oil and gas resources and so on, its strategic position, geostrategic position. And the way that Russia is positioning itself to be Iran's, best friend in the West, so to speak, is not necessarily a good thing for U.S. interests. So it's something to think about.
Yes, Mona.
Again, thank you. This is a wonderful panel. I think each of the panelists very adequately recognized the need for the U.S. and Iran to lay out its goals and objectives at the outset of negotiations. I think that's important. I think on the U.S. side, there's a noticeable lack in any specifics on just what our end game objective will be with regard to Iran. And so I was wondering if any of the panelists could talk about, in any sort of detail, what that U.S. objective, what that U.S. endgame should look like, what the U.S. should envision Iran's role in the region should be, Iran's relationship to the U.S. bilaterally, any sort of details. Thank you.
Okay, who will take that?
Look, the U.S. is engaged in the moment in a policy review trying to answer just that question. My sense is that there's an enormous debate. There are some who are willing to see Iran as a member of a new regional security forum. If the Gulf states don't want to expand the GCC, then you create something that's bigger and includes several on Iran's borders, whether it's Iraq, Afghanistan. There's a South Asia component to it as well. Those who kind of have a bigger vision of how do you bring Iran not just back into the community of nations, but into, develop a common kind of security or strategic vision with the Iranians. I think there are others who think, let's think small. Let's get them to stop, let's on their nuclear program. Let's get them to stop supporting Hamas and Hezbollah. Let's get them to recognize the Arab-Israeli peace process and thinks of it in terms of just our immediate goals. So I think I can't answer that question because I don't think they're there yet. I think they're thinking bigger than any administration has ever done, and I think that's the key to potential success. In that we're not thinking of just the immediate flashpoints, but also thinking what is it we want long term and how to change the fundamental problem we've had for 3 decades.
May I just add a comment?
Yes, sure.
If I may, very briefly. I think it is a very important concept to explore this question, what is the end game? And one of the reasons why NSP here at the level of I would say, of technique almost, seems to me that one of the probably things I've understood about this supreme leader is that if he's involved, he would accept to be involved if he knows what the end game is for him as well. And then how to get there, we can be all kind, but that is something which has to be, in a way, brought up into the surface. And when there will be the magician who will know how to involve the leader in this kind of story, I think I'm pretty convinced that he will, if that question is not said and clarified, he will not get involved. And if he doesn't get involved, then we go back to muddy waters again.
Ambassador.
Yes. During the discussion, the mention of Israel has been sort of omitted or not discussed to any extent. Where do they fit in the scheme of things? Are they going? Do you feel they will act either overtly or covertly to try to stop the nuclear program?
John?
I think, and I've been exploring this with some Israelis. I think that a U.S.-Iran détente, essentially, would actually benefit Israeli security quite dramatically. at least potentially. It would be difficult for a U.S. president not to, as part of that détente, get some security guarantees for Israel, for one thing. But Iran has already indicated, at least in the 2003 letter, that can be on the table. And the alternative, of course, is potentially catastrophic. If Bush had approved Olmert's request, if it was real, to bomb Iran's nuclear facilities, for example, as was reported in the New York Times, one can only imagine, what would have ensued in the region. And I'm afraid that is the dominant discourse in Israel right now. So I think we need game-changing diplomacy that keeps Israel in mind, but doesn't allow Israel to drive the game. And part of that is engaging them in a dialogue about what the United States' intentions are with respect to Iran, and that, in fact, Israel's security is likely to benefit from a détente. But of course, Israel has to do its part too on the Palestinian issue, and we're not seeing much movement from them on that.
I'm going to take two questions from the back, one from the front, together, and then we'll wrap up the session. Yes, please. Yeah, brief questions, please.
I'm Alan Kieswood. I was involved in the late Clinton administration in some of the maneuvers, and they didn't succeed. A couple of times we had our bags packed to leave, and the negotiations meetings were canceled, and the assumption was that the Supreme Leader nixed them the last moment. So I guess this is really a question for Johnny Pico. Is there enough door ajar that a program it suggested Mr. Tiernan would have some success?
Okay, let's take, yes, the lady there. Yeah. Yes.
I really appreciated Mr. Pico's emphasis on the dual narrative, the Iranian narrative, because I think that oftentimes the dual narrative of situations is a very forgotten dynamic, especially in the Middle East. I was wondering how Iranian Americans would play into the future of Iranian-American relations.
Okay, and then in the back, please. Did you have, yes, did you have a question? Take a couple of questions together. And
yes, Richard Parker with the American Foreign Policy Project. I just wanted to follow up on Mr. Litvak's comment about, excuse me, I'm hoarse as well, about the degree to which and the way to which Iran is actually defying norms of law with its nuclear program. And the reason I ask is because when talking to nuclear non-proliferation experts around in the course of my work, I've just been amazed at the degree to which they wax legalistic about this. People who are ordinarily...
Who's they?
What's that?
Who's the they in that sentence?
Oh...
no, I mean, not
well,
people, but are you talking Iranians or Americans?
American non-proliferation experts, yeah. It seems to be almost the end of the discussion for them. And so I started looking into this. I teach international law myself in my day job. And what one finds is that it's really actually quite murky. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, as you know, gives Iran the right to enrich for peaceful purposes. They are in full compliance with their safeguards agreements. They were in non-compliance with their secret enrichment facilities, which were exposed, but they've corrected
Could I ask you to be very brief? I'm running out of time.
Yes, very brief. But, so the main thing that they're in non-compliance with is these UN Security Council resolutions, defying 3 of them, ordering them to stop enrichment. But those, as you know, are political acts, and that Iran never signed on to. And so it's difficult. The United States would never accept, that we have to adhere to a resolution by a body that we're not participated in and so forth. So it's just very difficult. It's not as clear that there's this rogue state in legal terms. And I think that is one of the things that is causing this disconnect between the United States and Iran on their enrichment program.
Thank
So I was
you.
wondering if you could comment on that, and maybe John could as well.
Was there a question on this side? Yes, here, please.
There's obviously,
Can you wait for the mic, please?
thank you. There's obviously a lot that each side can do separately and that the two sides can do together. And I'd like to get some comments on in the area of exchanges. One area of exchange that was not mentioned was parliamentary exchanges. And apparently there is some movement and discussion on this line. Secondly, when President Ahmadinejad was at Columbia, he issued an invitation to American scholars and students to visit the Iranian universities, and that's another area. And the third area is many American journalists travel to Iran and report on Iran, but we do not accept Iranian journalists here.
Thank you. Provided Iranian scholars who go there don't end up in jail like I did, of course. I'm going to take one very quick comment from Sanam, and then we'll wrap up with...
It's actually a question, going back to the question of the narratives. In the U.S., we now have more of a discussion about the Iranian perspective on issues, but the prevailing sentiment is still very much that Iran is not reliable, Iran is the one that lets us down. And I think that in the panel today, we heard on a number of occasions that goodwill on their behalf did not beget goodwill on the part of the U.S., so whether it was Bush 1 or Bush 2 in Afghanistan. And my question is, what's the impact in terms of how the Iranians might perceive Americans, and what should the Americans do to redress these issues? Because if we go forward thinking we've always been the good guys, and they think that we've let them down, that's a non-starter. So I just wanted to...
Thank you. And one last question in the front, but just one sentence, please, a question.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed
just
the
your
meeting.
question,
Okay.
please. I'm running out of time.
The question is that I think what you're talking about is the shift from the society to the government. Don't you think that this approach that you're taking now would clinch another fist, which is fist of the society versus the United States?
Okay, thank you. That's it. We'll start.
John, you want?
John,
Okay.
the first question was...
Thank you. Yes. If I were to gamble, which I never do, well, probably I did it, not with money, but the leader, I think, as we speak today, I still would put my money on him, not because he will make a decision like the Pope, by all alone without reading the press, but sorry for that. But I think there are two ways that can help us practically in the negotiation that hopefully will emerge. One is that the Western governments have always known that there is a way to get to the leader and to have a conversation, so to speak. Not easy, but there is. It's very narrow, but there is, and there is a way to do it. And when the British did, they resolved the issue, by the way. But when this channel is approached, then the question of the end game should be there, number one. Number two, and this may seem strange, but coming from me particularly, but, I wouldn't rule out a very strange possibility that with all this détente going on, as John was mentioning, somebody may make a move that probably kind of surprises others. And one move that he could make would be to actually appoint, a la American way, a special, very special man to do the negotiations if he's not sure that they will succeed. And then we would be surprised of the name he may choose. But then he will have to accept taking the risk of where the negotiation goes. So that, I think, there are more possibilities that we can see at first, at prima facie, but it's not impossible in my view. I think I've finished my part.
Okay, John, we'll go through the whole panel. Could you take one of the...
Well, I'll just address the question about the sort of the legality of the sanctions in the UN Security Council resolutions. I think that there's a great deal of imbalance, or imbalance, I guess, is as good a word as any in the NPT and how it's applied. And the United States, on the one hand, needs to come to terms with that. I mean, the failure on Article 6 most prominently, but also the general hypocrisy of acting this way toward Iran and not toward other states that have added nuclear weapons since the original 5. And we need to come to grips with this as a sort of as a philosophical question, not as a legal question, not even as a negotiating question. But Iran also has to come to terms with its misbehavior on this, and it is misbehavior. I don't think there's any question about that, and especially the secrecy and the obstructionism that has accompanied this. So this is one of those cases where I think the lowering of tensions and a new kind of dialogue, and a dialogue that really tries to build trust, not just built on interest, but is also tries to actually create or recreate trust in the relationship, can, at a certain point then, have a fuller discussion about the nuclear issue that is not legalistic, that is not meant to be punitive, that is not carrots and sticks. So, it depends a lot on a number of steps we need to take, some dramatic, some small, to improve the relationship, and then the nuclear issue, I think, can follow suit more smoothly, perhaps.
I don't think there were any questions directed to me. I will respond to Saman's question. And I tried to frame a whole policy approach that dealt with all these their perceptions of our misdeeds with Iran over the past 30 years. But I also think that, let's be honest about this, folks. This whole tension was started when the Iranians seized the American embassy, whether it's Khobar or the Marine barracks bombings, or 2 embassies in Beirut. That there are a slew of incidents that Iran has providing IEDs that have killed hundreds, maybe thousands of American troops and lots of Iraqis as well. That, there's always this attitude that the United States is the one to blame for bad relations, and it's a two-way street. And the minute you start asking, and this goes back to the question you asked earlier about what can the Iranians do, it can deal with some of the problems we've had with Iran in the past as well. So I kind of rile at the question.
Thank you, Rob. You have the last.
I agree with Rob.
Okay. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you for MIT.